I want to start out by saying something that you underline so well and personify so well, and that is that these are human beings. They're sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters. They're you. You were homeless for 5 years. I was homeless for months as a teenager. I'm like junior varsity. You were out there for years. But I think we're both examples of the fact that this can be overcome and you can go on with your life and do things. So this situation is getting worse, not better right now. Is that a fair statement?
It is a fair statement. We've seen unsheltered homelessness grow all across the country, and it's not just in urban communities like Los Angeles. It's happening in rural communities. It's happening in suburban communities, and we have definitely seen an increase, and that's especially unsheltered homelessness over the last 5 years.
Let's talk about this so people understand our terminology, because if we're just going to be raw and candid about this, people in businesses, people in neighborhoods, people who take their kids to school, they don't want to walk by these encampments. Most of the time they can't. You can't walk down the sidewalk because they set up tents and then they expand because they have their belongings and all of that out there, and they don't smell good. They don't look good. They're oftentimes defecating on the sidewalk because they don't have facilities. They're urinating on the sidewalk. Then it gets hot out, and you and I have been in these places. They smell rancid.
Yes.
And I say that not being judgmental, but it's just the fact. For everybody that says how unpleasant that is, imagine living in it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Absolutely. And, again, and I say this often, we live in the richest country in the world. No one should have to live in those conditions. And many times, these are people who don't want to be in that situation. I would say none of them want to be in that situation, but they're forced into it. They're forced into it because of economic conditions, because of the lack of treatment, because of structural racism in some cases. So these are underlying issues that we have to address to be able to get people so they don't have to live in that. And you're right. The more we talk about the realities, it's not, some people think it's like people, urban camping, if you will, that it's some kind of leisurely activity. And we know that that's far from the truth. It's dangerous. All of the things you talked about exist. And so we have to do better. People should not have to be forced to live like that.
Okay, now let me play devil's advocate. I don't want anybody rolling their eyes about this and saying, first thing you did was play the race card here and say, well, some of it is structured racism. First off, what percentage of the population are people of color?
So African Americans make up about 40% of the population. They only make up 13% of the general population in America.
Yeah.
When you look at Pacific Islanders, it's a 9-to-1 ratio. If you look at Native American, indigenous people, it's a 3-to-1 ratio. And the reason why structural racism is why we think that exists is that if you look at poverty, there is a relationship to poverty that changes when you talk about these people of color. So if you look at people of color, the number of homeless people, the number actually is higher than those in poverty. But for all other races, white Americans, Asian Americans, that number goes down. So poverty isn't the underlying factor. So it has to be some of the traditional structural issues that have plagued people of color for decades.
Okay. And when you say structural issues, fill in the blanks for people. So we're on fill in the blanks. So fill in the blanks.
Absolutely. So let me fill in some of the blanks there. So when we talk about structural issues, we talk about the fact that people discriminate in who they have in their housing. So in order for us to be able to create enough housing units, we have to have people that don't deny people housing because of their race. We know that still exists in this country. When we started out in the 30s with housing programs, those programs were not we had what was called redlining. And so people were not able to purchase homes if they were people of color or immigrants also. And that's changed over the centuries. Some people who immigrated from Ireland or some Asian countries or other parts of Europe were considered other. And so Black people and other people of color have continued to be other. And so when we created housing programs like public housing, that housing was segregated at the beginning. And it was actually segregated in places that were integrated already. The jobs programs created in the New Deal, people of color were not able to access those jobs. Servicemen returning from the World War, veterans, there were GI Bills, but people of color were not able to get into those GI Bills. And what was created was impoverished communities, and they are what people consider ghettos. And what happened is not only were people not able to generate wealth, and one of the easiest way to generate wealth in this country is through home ownership. So if you don't own a home, you can't generate wealth. And so we have had decades of disinvestment in those communities. And now they're food deserts. They don't have the healthcare facilities. They don't have banks. They have predatory lenders. And so that cycle's continued. And even in the home ownership, 2 weeks ago in Baltimore, Maryland, there were two professors at Johns Hopkins University. They were a mixed race couple. There was an appraisal of their housing by an appraiser, of course. The first time it was the African-American woman who met the appraiser. They appraised the house and she got a price. They thought it was low, so they took all of her identity out of the house. The white husband was the person who got the house appraised, and there was a $236,000 difference. And so we know that it still exists in this country, and especially in communities that are in the South.
Yeah, and research into real estate agencies, real estate showings with couples, individuals that are African American still reveal redlining. They're just careful about it.
And banks are still getting accused. Wells Fargo, just a few years ago, was accused of redlining and paid enormous fines in Baltimore, Maryland.
Yeah.
So the definition of structural racism is intentional decisions made by a government or a structure to advantage one group of people over another.
Yeah. And to break that down, we're talking about lending institutions. We're talking about mortgage companies as a lending institution. We're talking about housing. And when you think about it, your number one asset for most families is their home. That's what appreciates across time. The
Absolutely.
biggest percentage of their net worth is their home. And if you're denied the opportunity to own a home or buy as much of a home or in a favorable area that's going to appreciate, then you're denied building that wealth.
Exactly.
And so I just wanted people to know that's what you were talking about. I mean, those are real things.
They're real things. And, kind of when I look at other factors, and these are things that, sometimes people can write off things. We can talk about the over exposure of people of color in the criminal justice system. Although, if you think about the crimes related to substance abuse, the levels of use are the same. However, the people who are convicted of those crimes and the length of sentences is different if you're a person of color. And the one that really sticks out to me is in healthcare. So if you look at maternal health, for instance, if you take a look at that issue, the death of mothers and the death of children is the same for mothers of color with advanced degrees. That is at the same level of women, white women with less than a 7th grade education. So there's something wrong there. And until we come to grips with it, until we actually create actual solutions that address it, we'll always be stuck in this cycle. And I think we're coming to a realization that there is a problem. We've started to talk about it a lot, but I haven't seen real solutions. I mean, things like the fair housing laws are really, there's no enforcement. And so we have to come to grips with that.